great to see everyone for this budget work session. So, Avril, the first item that you wanted to take up was a review of the FY 2022 first past expenditures. Is that correct? All right, well, let's go for it.
And her team in budget. So I'll go ahead and turn it over now to budget, and as I turn my cell phone off.
Good morning, Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
So it's taking a moment. I'm going to get the presentation set up. So my name is Jennifer Barnett with Budget. Today is the first of several sessions in which we will review the fiscal year 2022 budget, providing you with various aspects of the budget, as well as requesting some guidance from you all for specific areas of funding. Our timeline for the fiscal year 2022 budget development for staff began back in September. The board budget retreat was in December, and in January and February, we reviewed some of the follow-up items from the retreat, along with an early look at current year revenue trends. Today, we will review fiscal year 2022's first pass expenditures. A reminder that the first pass is estimated expenditures after departments have submitted their requests and justifications, and have reviewed those requests with assistant county managers and county manager and budget staff. First pass includes items that is currently recommended by the county manager to remain in the budget, however, is subject to change based on final revenue estimates, emerging priorities, and any guidance from you. April is when we expect to review fiscal year 2022's projected revenues. In order to do that, we will review first the estimated fiscal year 21 year end. With 2021 as the revaluation year, the resultant impact to revenues occurs in fiscal year 2022, and we anticipate discussing tax rate scenarios with you at our next meeting. We would also review any changes to expenditures since our first pass. We will additionally review proposed fee schedule changes at that time as well. We are tentatively calendared to meet with education partners and fire districts on May 11th. Fire districts will present requests for any that are requesting a rate that is greater than revenue neutral. Like the county, all taxing jurisdictions are subject to the revenue neutral calculation. This will also include Asheville City Schools' supplemental tax rate. A local government must calculate the revenue neutral rate for each separate levy included in our budget ordinance. May 18th is the current proposed date for the county manager's recommended budget message. June 1st is the tentative date for the public hearing on the recommended budget. You all have the discretion to either adopt the budget on June 1st, at a regularly scheduled meeting on June 15th, or any other specially called meeting that's properly noticed. Any questions about the timeline?
So we could adopt it immediately following the public hearing if we chose to. Okay, that's good to know. I don't think we've ever done that before that I can remember. I think it's on, right? Okay.
We actually, in the pandemic this past year, did that.
Okay.
So you all did move to adopt the same day as the public hearing.
As the public hearing, okay. Mm-hmm. Typically, I think we do the public hearing and then the next meeting. So we could do it either way, and I guess we can just decide as we get closer to that date.
That's correct.
Okay.
We'll revisit this timeline with our each subsequent meeting, and you all can guide that.
Okay.
All right. So today, like I had said before, we want to review expenditures, and in order for us to review the proposed first pass expenditures, we'd like to take a look at the fiscal year 21 amended budget, look at the fiscal year 2022 requested budget from departments, and then the first pass expenditures for 2022. We will review in some additional detail personnel requests or changes that are currently included in the first pass budget, significant operating drivers or significant changes to operating and program support. We additionally would like to explore and receive commissioner direction as it relates to staffing requests specifically for 2 grants, the Safety and Justice Challenge Grant and the Community Paramedicine Grant, and then a review of some of those items that we've collected information on strategic plan priorities, asking for additional guidance from you all on. So to begin our review with expenditures, the fiscal year 21 amended expenditure budget totals $347.1 million. If you will recall, we recently added almost $3 million in expenditures for the OPEB contribution, so that recently, inflates that to 347. And the amended budget reflects changes, so budget amendments that occur since the time of adoption is what the amended budget is. Salaries and benefits makes up the majority of the general fund budget to fund staff to provide services that the county is either mandated, expected, or best positioned to provide. Program support is the second highest percentage, which includes $89.5 million to AB Tech and our K-12 schools. Health and Human Services makes up $18.1 million of the program support, where the majority is offset by state and federal revenue sources for mandated services. And economic development is $4 million in the amended budget, and early childhood programming is $2.8 million. Moving on to the fiscal year 2022 requested expenditure budget. So after the departments submitted their personnel-related requests and their operating requests, we started with a requested budget of $365.1 million. The fiscal year 2022 first pass expenditure budget is $360.3 million. In comparing these side by side, we can see that the first pass budget is $4.7 million less than the requested budget, and first pass is 3.8% of an increase in comparison to the fiscal year 21 amended budget. We do want to break down the 3.8% growth, so we will review that detail over the next several slides. Before I do that, I would like to just take a moment to review and remind us what each of these ledgers. So as we talk about the budget, these are the our ledger summaries, ledger accounts. But just want to review the main content of what's included in those. Salary and benefits is probably the most obvious one. That is salary and benefits for regular positions, temporary position salaries, and then any grant-funded position salaries and benefits that are budgeted in the general fund. Program support is primarily made up of education local current expense funding, economic development incentive, and program areas across social services and public health. Operating is what you generally think of for contract and professional services, travel and training, utilities, office expenses. Debt service are our debt obligations for previous financing of projects, as well as budget for estimated future fiscal year 2022 debt costs. Transfers and other financing are budgets to transfer dollars from the general fund in support of items that exist in other funds, such as the transportation funding and the affordable housing program funding. And then capital outlay are expenditures for equipment and fleet, which are new or replacement. The last is contingency. So from a budgetary perspective, Contingency is budgeted as contingency, and then as you all authorize its use, it gets transferred into the area of the budget it's needed. For instance, the fiscal year 2021 contingency amount of $1 million was authorized for use for public health and emergency services for pandemic response. And that's why you don't see it still in the budget for the amended, because it's actually then moved out to the other ledgers in those cost centers. Any questions before we start kind of delving into some of the details?
I said one thought on a slide. I think you passed over the number of staff positions, I guess, proposed, and then the quantity that was advanced. I'm just generally curious on what those total 68. Yeah, I think 68 positions. I'm just a little bit curious what those other positions are.
Okay.
That didn't make the 27.
All right, sure. I am. Let me grab. I am realizing. Yes. Yes. Okay. I apologize. I'm having some technical. I'm trying to sync with what's happening on the other screen. So if you'll give me one moment.
Sure.
Thank you for your patience. All right, I apologize. Thank you. So, Commissioner Sloan, so your question is around the positions that were part of the original 68 requested. Okay. So is your question you'd like for me to review, like?
Oh, we don't have to talk about it.
Okay,
Certainly now, but
so
just,
you would like to have a packet of information that maybe shows those starting position requests,
yeah,
and then now how we are at the 27.
correct.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's acceptable for you for us to send that to you in a packet following today's
Totally.
meeting?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I would like to review the 27 regular positions that have remained in the budget. The original 68 positions totaled a $4.3 million request, and in comparison, the 27 that currently remain in first pass is a $1.4 million request.
The cost shown also does include benefits, correct?
It does. That's a fully loaded cost.
Okay, thank you.
So I had not planned to review this list in its entirety, but we can certainly do that if you'd like to. There were a few that I did want to draw your attention to, but if you do have specific questions on the others, I'll be happy to answer them. We will review in further detail in today's discussion the community paramedic and program manager positions. These positions are a partial year request following the conclusion of grant funding. We made a commitment to you that grant-funded positions are time-limited unless you all support the continuation of them with county funds. In the same scenario is the 3 pretrial services screener positions. The request is for 1 full-time and 2 part-time positions for a partial year where the grant funding will no longer be available to cover those costs. One other to point out is we've made concerted efforts to address temp positions over the last few fiscal years, meaning that long-term temps effectively really need to be converted to regular positions based on HR's evaluation of their scope of work and the hours that they're being utilized to support day-to-day operations. HR has determined that a remaining telecommunicator temp position in Emergency Services 911 should be converted to a regular position based on those historical hours and scope of work. Are there any of these in particular that you would like to ask questions about, or you want to talk about the code enforcement officer?
Many of you have seen the requests and the complaints from citizens around nuisance abatements in our community. We currently don't have a position for code enforcement that really gets out and responds to those requests. We were using a hybrid model where we have pulled employees from different departments to address these issues. The position you see there today, the code enforcement officer, will help to address those specific and be the person that the community can call when they have nuisances, and we can respond to that. So that's a need that we have that is included in this year's budget that we haven't had before. In addition, yesterday I responded to you regarding some builders that are complaining about our septic. The position you see here for environmental health specialists, that is a position that once approved can help to address that need. So those are mostly based on need in our community right now. Those two are, in my mind, some of the most vital positions that you have on your list.
The planning position, that's the community development analyst position. Oh, it's the environmental health specialist position.
This is your septic and wastewater
Right.
position, yes.
And is that position funded through fees that builders pay to get their building permits, or how does that work?
Not 100%, no, that will be general fund funding.
I would say in part, those fees would cover the cost of the whole provision of service for environmental health. But my recollection is that it is not fully covered by the fees that they generate.
Why don't we raise the fees? Seems like it's just a position that should, you want to get a building permit. I would definitely want to get one faster than we're turning them around now, but it seems reasonable that it should cover its own cost.
We can, and we can look at our fee schedule. That is the conversation when we look at revenues, but we can increase our fees to cover this position completely. I would agree that to decrease the turnover, it would go.
And I think most builders would be happy to pay it if they can, get the service that they're looking for. So, okay.
Thanks.
Are there any other specific items that I can attempt to answer some questions for you on today?
Looks like to me that included are some positions we already approved, right? The library assistants? Okay.
Positions we looked at a 3 or 4 year plan for libraries to get them the staffing that they need. So we delayed the ones from last year's budget and brought those to you last month. These are the, excuse me, this is the second wave of those positions. So these are part-time positions that the library would need to continue the service that they're providing.
Okay, thank you.
I believe there are actually 17 or so positions asked in the library, and we cut that in half. So when we send a list of the 68, you would see there was a lot more that we decided to trim back. And instead of having a 3 or 4 year build out for the library, it would now be a 5 year build out.
Thanks for the clarification.
So the 8, the last month's meeting we approved, was it 8 or 6 library assistants we approved? 8, okay, so that's a separate 8 is what you're saying? Okay.
Yes, sir.
So there's also a planning department position on that list, I think, for a long-range planner. That's
correct.
That's separate as well, okay.
Yes.
Is the internal auditor an expansion?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
And the community paramedic positions, do those relate to the slides we'll see later in the
Yes.
presentation? Okay,
Yes.
great.
This is not an expansion. This is to keep those that are grant funded. We need for you to make the decision that it'll be county funded.
Thank you.
So I wanted to talk to you about significant drivers in those primary areas, so salary and benefits to begin with. there's a total of a $5.5 million increase request in the fiscal year 2022 first pass budget for salary and benefits, and wanted to walk through what are those components. So $1.6 million of that is the impact to the baseline budget for the April 1.45% cost of living adjustment. You saw the $1.4 million of recommended new personnel. $1.2 million is full year position salaries of positions that were approved in fiscal year 21 adopted budget to begin January. So last year we had and I can't remember off the top of my head how many positions, I think maybe 11, where we established a begin date of January. It was a way to help reduce expenditures in 21's budget. So those positions now carry forward in 2022 for a full year of position budget. We additionally had some recently, some recently approved positions that were 1/4 of a year. So those positions as 1/4 of a year then become full year positions for next year. So that's the 1.2. We are seeing a $1 million impact as a result of the state retirement required employer contribution share increase. So the employer contribution went for regular employees from 10.19% to 11.29%. And for law employees, it went from 10.9% to 12.14%. So that equates to about $1 million additional impact to our budget for next fiscal year. A success, we've been able to achieve a $900,000 reduction for the general fund cost share of our health insurance. This has resulted from lower claims and better negotiated terms. And then the final $1.2 million, so approximately $1 million of that 1.2 is for retiree obligations for previously established early retirement incentives, and then about $200,000 is the full year impact of already approved compensation changes or salary adjustments as it related to the salary and compensation study. Any questions on salary and benefits? So for the purposes of today, what I'd like to do is to talk through significant operating drivers. But in this, I've captured information for both operating and program support. It's just a little easier to look at those ledgers collectively. So for the requested budget, there was a $5.3 million net increase that was in the requested budget, and in the first pass budget, we have included $4.8 million of an increase in fiscal year 2022. We're going to walk through those. So operating and program support, primary drivers. I'll begin with information technology. So 1.9 million of the 2.3 is related to deferred maintenance and technology refresh for IT. When we were developing the budget last year and evaluating for expenditure reductions, this is an area where we deferred some of our items to account for projected revenue shortfalls. The K through 12 and AB Tech local fund budget support is included in the first pass budget as a 3% increase. So for Buncombe County Schools, Asheville City Schools, and AB Tech, for the purposes of first pass, we have included a 3% increase to the schools. We did provide to the schools the education funding formula as we had previously established for them. The percent growth, it is higher. It's like 5.2. There are some factors that influence that because of our need to decrease so significantly the budget for 21. So it skews that funding formula. So we know we've used that kind of as a standard in terms of beginning the conversation with our education partners. We've made them aware that 3% is what we have included in our first pass, and and have asked, obviously, that if they, when they're coming to make their request, that if it exceeds that, that's, up for you for consideration.
So you said the growth number for the budget is 5.5?
I think 5.2.
That's the estimated overall revenue growth of the
Unrestricted revenue growth.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
And that gets a little, yes, it gets skewed, but then we also have to choose the rate at which you set the ad valorem. I mean, so it's this makes it a difficult year to really use that as a solid guide for unrestricted revenue growth. Because we don't quite really know what that is until the tax rate's established.
Sure.
Yeah.
So it's just the current forecasted number.
That's
basically.
correct.
And it's a bigger number, but part of the point is last year it was a smaller number because of the forecasted impacts of COVID and all that. So while this is bigger, it's kind of over a 2-year average. It's somewhere in between those two.
That's
right. Okay. And do you recall what was the growth in the school's budget in the last budget cycle? We're looking at 3% this year was.
So I'd have to go back to see where we finally ended, because I think in our early proposal we were at the 1 point something, but there was a decision to give them what was larger than that unrestricted revenue growth calculation, and
Yes.
I would need to go back and get that information for you.
Right. So last year we did above the budget. This year we're forecasting for it to be below, but again, it's kind of like on a 2-year basis. It might be fairly similar
To look at.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, let's
We can do that.
get that information again. So, all right.
All right. So I'll also just point out, so we, in going through the various cost centers, really chose to kind of highlight those that were greater than $50,000, at a time, or at. So I'm trying to figure out some other ones that I would point out. So the general services, that $584,000 increase for that cost center is actually where we've been working to streamline our janitorial and utility expenses. Previously, we had some cost centers who were paying them out of their own individual, really trying to work to streamline that back to oversight by general services, and then really begin to evaluate the request for proposals around janitorial contracts and really making that a little more of a uniform process. So that's another area. So it's not really a net increase for them. It's a shift to their budget. And then I'm happy to review or discuss any of the other items here. ID bureaus, 2 new fingerprint scanners. I think they're currently operating on Windows 7 still, so we're at a kind of critical point where we need to replace those.
On the pre-K, there's a $73,000 increase, but that doesn't include the bigger increase that we're talking about.
That's correct. What we left kind of in our base first pass budget was that escalation of 2%. Based on the prior resolution, and that equates to $73,440 is the dollar amount. And we'll definitely, for consideration and discussion, is the $851,000. All right. So also wanted to point out some areas where we've actually seen some reductions. So we had net increases to some cost centers, and then we have other areas where we have some net decreases. The direct assistance. So in the amended budget, we came forward with some additional funding that had been provided to Health and Human Services as pass-through. So that's in the 21 budget, but it wouldn't be in the 22 budget, so it reflects as a decrease. Elections decreases related to haven't had a presidential election in 21, and you don't have that repeated in 2022. The justice resources support, we've talked a few times around their previous services that have been provided through contracted services and personnel and are now have been brought in-house So you'd see a decrease in their contracted services. It actually shifts a little bit to the salary and benefits ledger. You can see their library where they've transferred the janitorial services to general services. And then the playground funding, which I'll speak to a little bit later as well. We don't currently have a placeholder in for the discussion around the playground funding or the extracurricular enhanced curricular activity support. So it was in 21 and it's not currently in 2022. So there's some primary areas for decreases. Any questions?
Just on that last point that you made, so we did have a discussion about how that might be structured, the supplemental education funding, but so it's not currently recommended in the budget. So if we wanted to do that, we would need to bring that back in and it would be structured as was discussed at the recent meeting.
Yes, and so we have worked and had those conversations with both Asheville City and Buncombe County Schools. They are compiling lists from their individual school requesters that fit those categories of funding. So that was the playground, enhanced curricular in association with like their student clubs and organizations. And so I have had more frequent conversation with Asheville City, and they are in the final kind of fine tuning of their list. And then what our hope is that we will take that information from them. I've asked them to prioritize those lists, and we'll be happy to share those lists with you all. And then internally, what we had proposed is that we would look at making a recommendation to you for a dollar amount. So we would bring that to you as well. We are hoping at our April 22nd meeting. Most of the detail that we focus on in the conversation is around the general fund because it's the county's primary operating fund. However, we do want to make you aware of two additional personnel requests, one in the Solid Waste Enterprise Fund for a scale operator, and then one request for a temp conversion in the Internal Service Health and Dental Fund for a part-time physician extender position. Again, this is kind of the same scenario around the temp position, working on the number of hours, and that's a part-time request, and they were utilizing a temp staff in a part-time capacity as well. So those are two other personnel requests for two other funds. So I mentioned earlier that we need some guidance and input from you all regarding some funding decisions. Currently, the Safety and Justice Challenge Grant covers pre-trial screener positions through January 31st, 2022. In the fiscal year 22 budget, the request to be able to staff pre-trial screener positions in 22 from February to June is for an estimated total of $58,724. This funding would support one full-time and two part-time positions. And the Safety and Justice Challenge Grant was renewed, however, based on programming needs, and to be able to continue the level of service, we are asking for the budget to continue these positions. I'll just note that the table at the bottom reflects some accomplishments and outcomes, which you heard our Justice Services Director speak to several weeks ago. And I would note that the overall percent of diverted individuals into pretrial out of total bookings has improved, so the percent has increased.
And just to clarify, we could connect the dots to some extent between the $224,000 being saved by Justice Resource Services due to more streamlined services, and then this is a budget request to add new positions. But if we look at the totality of all that, we see we're actually saving money under Justice Resources. Is that one way to think about this?
Contracted services, because
Right.
those services came in-house.
So
Yes.
savings basically that were
Correct.
realized through more streamlined.
Yes, we did have a savings when we brought it to you last year.
Right.
There was a savings versus contractor salaries.
Okay.
I don't recall how much money that was at this point.
And I would have to go back to see. I understand, you're correct, we did achieve some savings previously, but I would need to come back to you with like a definitive answer.
Okay, there's 224,000 on the slide on the significant operating drivers. Is that
Which slide are you looking at?
significant operating drivers? It's
Yeah,
two
that
to
was
three
reduction.
prior to this one.
Out of the reduction. And what I would need to go
Yeah.
back to detail is to look to see where that reduction went.
Yeah.
I can't remember if it fully went to salary and benefits. Rusty.
I'm not trying to overcomplicate. I was just trying to sort of think about at the departmental level.
Yes, so the structure of that transition was that effective January 1st, that the contracts would go away
Yeah.
and we would hire internal staff. So what you see there is just the contract piece. That's not the offset of the amount that comes into the salaries and benefits. So
Okay.
I don't know off the top of my head if it's 100%, but a large portion of that transitions to the salaries and benefits ledger. So it's not a true $200,000 savings because there is that increase on salaries.
Okay, thank you very much. That's helpful. I was just sort of trying to think about all of that under one umbrella for a second.
And what would the annual cost be of this? I get that it's 58,000 to finish out this year, but then ongoing annually, what will that cost be?
I'm looking for one of our staff who may have that.
We'll get that to you in a minute.
Yes.
But it's almost 6 months, so is it pretty logical that it'll be like basically
At
double
least
that, a
double
little bit more
that.
than double that? Kind
That
of,
would be correct.
yeah. It would just be extending that out into the future.
Yes. So that's a decision point. If you want us to keep that in the budget, that's one thing you can think through.
So this is currently in the budget.
Yes.
This is the first pass.
This is okay. This is the first one. And one of the things, this is not just related to this specific item, but I guess one of the things I think there's been some discussion about over the last year. I mean, with the pandemic and the jail population coming down, really quickly, there's been some discussion about how that detention number generally affects kind of operating costs for the department and the county. And I would just say, as we go through this budget cycle, that's something I would like to just understand better, right? There's all kinds of reasons why we think that's a good outcome if we can do it safely, for the community. But just from a purely budgetary standpoint, I'd like to understand that better in terms of how that, and what aspects of the detention center are just sort of fixed costs, and the number of people who are there at any given time doesn't really change, versus, if there's 500 or 400 or 300, how do those differences affect our cost to operate the facility? Because it's an important facility, and then there's these kind of decisions too that we can make in investing in different initiatives that can influence those numbers, which cost money, but also might save money. So just at a high level, if there's a way that we could kind of understand those different scenarios, scenarios better, that'd be great. Any other questions on this item right now?
From a process perspective, as we work our way through these, is the vision that we'll do kind of initial questions, discussion, or that we'll go any further than that in terms of the mood of the board currently on these items?
So I don't think we're not going to take any formal votes on anything today. If people have questions, certainly we want to get the questions on the table. If people have comments, I'd certainly, I think it's fine to share them, even though we're not going to take specific votes on this. But Avril, I just didn't know, in terms of Jasmine's point, I don't know how specific you were looking for the feedback to be today versus sort of taking this information in. We're going to have subsequent kind of follow-up meetings about this. How specific are you looking for feedback today on different questions?
If it's an absolute no, then I would like to get that guidance today. But our recommendation is to continue this work because it is so impactful on the jail population. I think this is one of the strategies that we help to use to bring that numbers down.
Yeah.
So it's in the budget as a recommendation, but if it was an absolute no from this board, then I would like to get that guidance because these expenditures help to guide the revenue conversation the next time around.
Right, so if people have concerns about a particular budget item, you can certainly raise those. But don't feel like today's meeting is your only chance to say, hey, wait a second, I'm not sure that's a top priority for me if I have to choose between this and other things. There's going to be plenty of other chances to take all this in and then give further feedback on the things that we really want to make sure stay in versus things that might be lower priority. So this is that initial discussion. All right. Let's keep going.
So a similar request is to continue the community paramedicine program with funding in the amount of $250,000 for the 4 full-time positions that we had referenced earlier for January through June 2022. So that's 6 months. Dogwood Trust provided the initial funding that provided dollars for personnel and some capital outlay purchases, some vehicle purchases. And those dollars carry the program through December of 2021. So our request is to continue status quo with those same 4 positions, not an expansion for the last 6 months of the 2022 cycle. There is some program data provided in the table at the bottom and reflects about 4 months worth of community paramedic call volume and contacts.
My understanding is also they are going to continue seeking additional grant funding. Is that correct?
We are applying for additional
Right,
grant funding,
right,
but
which
we
of
haven't been awarded
course
anything
isn't
at this point.
Guaranteed.
Yes.
Right.
But if it was guaranteed, then we were expecting it monies, but there's no guarantee. So the hope would be if this program is to continue, we need that funding from the county coffers. So if that's the case, that is why it's here. But if money does come from funding, we'll come back to the board and appropriate that money and then don't have to use the county money. But I didn't want to go into the year without this conversation and then
course.
come back later.
Of course.
And
No,
then
I agree and support that. I was just curious if it was going to fully be relied on the county from here on out, or grants were going to be continued, because that had been my understanding. So thanks.
And then Commissioner Edwards, so for the grants, I mean, obviously there might be consideration in the application for whether you can supplant or not. So that would just be reliant on what the funder indicates.
I
Jennifer,
think it's tricky to start relying on grants to pay salaries, so kind of have a love-hate with grants
Yes,
for that reason.
yes.
yeah, just a question about the math here, just so I understand ballpark the cost of one community paramedic per 12-month period. Is that around $100K, $110,000? Is that?
I'm going to look back
Okay.
to one of the budget
Yeah.
analyst team to see if they have that at their fingertips. Okay. You want to speak to the variance in the hours?
Yeah. And that was for 6 months.
These paramedic positions are also like billed in overtime. They work 3,120 hours per year as opposed to the standard 2,080. So their costs are loaded with that built in overtime. So they're a bit more substantial in annual costs than the average 2080 position.
Why don't we hire more people and then not do that?
Why do we?
Why don't we hire more people and then not have all the overtime?
I think, well, it's part of the nature of paramedics that they're used to working these hours. They prefer these overtime hours. We've not had a lot of ability to hire paramedics on only a 20/80 hour because at the standard hourly rate of a paramedic, it's not that substantial so they expect the built-in overtime allows them, they're accustomed to that, and that's the culture of
So
paramedics.
I'll jump in as well. They actually work a 12-hour shift, so it makes it a little bit harder to just do your regular 8 hours because of that 12-hour shift. We have talked before about going to an 8-hour shift, but to go to an 8-hour shift at 24 hours, you then have to have a whole nother crew.
Yeah.
So it is much cheaper to do the overtime at 12-hour shift than it would be to hire another crew to do 3 8-hour shifts per day.
So is it like a 12-hour day, 4-day a week, or what's the typical schedule for that? Or 3 days a week?
I'll
or
have
4
to
days a
get
week?
back with you on the shift, but it's so many days on and so many days off.
Yeah.
So that cycle there's a built-in overtime because of that cycle when they've taken off. But I have to get back to you with the exact shift time.
So I hear you that that's the culture, but how does that impact staff retention in our paramedics as well?
Last year, we studied the conversation about going to 8-hour shifts to help
Right.
reduce that overtime. And when he talked about the culture, it was almost like, are you crazy to even
Okay.
think about going that way?
Fair enough.
They're used to that on-off 12-hour
12
shift, so
hours.
they actually requested to leave it at the 12-hour shift instead of to hire more people and create another shift to do 3 shifts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
But it'd be more expensive to hire another shift because I believe there's a 2 or 3, how many paramedics per shift? 3 per truck? So it'd be 3 for every truck if you're thinking about that to get to 8-hour shifts. But then there's that handoff between when they get off and when they come on, so it's staggered time, so it's automatic overtime after that 12 hours.
And then once you figure in the per position costs, you're actually expanding your costs substantially.
Way more than just the overtime.
Okay. And with the 12-hour shifts, that means there's basically 2 shifts a day, and this program is there 365, 24 hours a day.
Yes.
I think we all just learned a lot.
So Commissioner Sloan.
Yeah.
What's the total?
So it's about $99,000 per year per position.
In salary and benefits?
Fully loaded.
Fully loaded, yeah. Okay. I just ask because in the back of my mind, I'm just thinking about a goal or a thought to expand this program in the future, and just would like to learn more about those costs, and perhaps even
And
aspirationally.
as we think about expanding this program, also remember it's not just paramedics that would be expanding, it would be some,
Yeah.
yes, other services to really build out a change model, would be other types of services, not just the paramedicine piece.
I hope we can talk about that when we start talking about the federal funding coming in.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I would agree, but the federal funding is one-time money, so if you're talking about salaries, it only get you so far before it does transition.
I just meant the general concept of how we build out a very successful pilot program into a full program.
Perfect.
Thank you.
And just before we conclude this, though, if we did, I think in terms of this specific proposal right here, I think it sounds good. All those answers I thought were really great. If you were going to really build it out into the future, expand it, there were going to be more staffs here, then perhaps the change in the shift schedule might actually make sense. What I'm hearing is if you're only going to hire a few additional people, then you have to kind of do it this way because you won't have enough staff to shift more than the 12-hour shifts. But if it were a bigger program, then perhaps different structures might make more sense to consider at that point. Is that a reasonable question to think about? Or
Yeah,
is
we
this
can-
really just the way it's kind of,
And we
this is
can
the way it
add
would always
that,
be done?
we can add that to the mix for this specific program, not the ambulance services, because that 12-hour shift works for them. But on the community paramedicine side, we can think through that because there'd be social workers and other types of work that will be done here, so we can think through what that would look like as we build this out.
Okay. Alrighty, what's next?
So, similar to previous years, we are bringing forward areas and amounts that staff need guidance from you all on. They are outlined here. These items are not currently included in the first pass expenditure amounts. In our various meetings with you since December, we've documented items and amounts as it relates to the desire to progress the strategic plan priorities. The ordering of these are alphabetical by strategic focus area. We need direction from you as to your support for all of them, none of them, some of them, as well as any requested changes to funding amounts, or if there are other items not on this list, please let us know. And then just a reminder that still to come will be a placeholder amount for the education special support funding. So just to quickly review, you have in your handouts a little more narrative around kind of each of these specific items, but I'll review each of them briefly. So an estimate of $255,000 is a placeholder to fund a pilot program. The proposed program is based on a model called REACH, and it is meant to develop grade-level capable leaders by preparing students to mentor and tutor, resulting in improved literacy outcomes for both. The second item is a request increase to the early childhood education funding by the $851,000. And then we have a request to increase conservation easements to $750,000. That's an addition of $510 for direct conservation easement funding. And then the increase in transactions will need a corresponding additional staffing support, so adding 1 FTE and a supervisory realignment would be needed for a total of $603,000. Matt Cable with our transportation division has indicated the need to replace a reduction of NCDOT funding. So we've have expected to receive a reduction from NCDOT funding in the amount of $259,000. Those are dollars that we would be asking to maintain the current level of service to our senior residents. And then intergovernmental relations, staff provided an estimate of $10 million over 5 years to establish broadband access. So the fiscal year 2022 estimated impact is $2 million. In recent weeks, there's been information that the local fiscal recovery dollars could be an eligible funding source for broadband. Therefore, consideration of this project would need to be determined by you for a general fund or prioritized for local fiscal recovery dollars if your desire is to support it. So that's a summary of the current items, and again, we'd like to hear from you if you have interest in any other items that we need to evaluate.
So the 3.9 is not in the first pass totals.
That's correct.
So I guess just generally, that roughly $4 million is, I guess, where does that number come from in terms of that total?
You mean in terms of how are we going to cover it?
Yeah, I guess I'm just asking. You created this list.
Yes.
And how did you come to that grand total? I guess in terms of a maximum suggestion to us.
This is what we've heard. This is just what we've.
These are the dollar amounts we've heard either from staff or commission or.
Yes, we've heard, I think, from 2 commissioners specifically for these list of numbers. We've also heard for replacing money from NCDOT, which is something that we would need for you to weigh in on if you're taking on the state level funding. And if there's others that we're missing, please, we want to make sure we have that complete list. And then, again, if it's a hard no, then we need to know that. But if it's something that you support at this level or more, we need to know that as well. Because at that point, then we can go back and look at the revenue side and really come back to you with good thought out solutions for revenues.
I guess just a process question I have is, and we may not know the answer, but sort of how some of these intersect with the local recovery dollars. So certainly broadband was lifted up as a place where we might be able to use some of that funding.
Yeah.
Are there thoughts that there might be any other places on this list, early child education or potentially the mountain mobility, where there'd be an opportunity to use some of that, or do we just not know yet?
Don't know yet.
Don't know yet. Okay, so maybe that's just sort of an asterisk alongside at least several of these, that there might be an opportunity to allocate some of those dollars.
But we do know that the broadband is named specifically
Right.
in those
Yeah.
funds.
Yeah, so that's the one we have the clearest insight on.
Also, my understanding was funding loss as well. So the DOT funding loss might fit that category.
I think
It was funding loss based on your budget from pre-COVID. So I think they were looking at if you were lost sales tax or property tax or something like that, because I'm not sure they're talking about state level funding.
Okay.
But that's something that we can put on our list as we get more guidance. We can ask
Yeah.
that question specifically as well.
Because I assume the DOT funding loss is due to gas tax revenue loss, which was due to COVID. So
I would need to ask.
I don't know. Yeah.
Maybe I need to ask specifically to Matt. But,
Yeah.
you know, and I know Avril, made this comment earlier, but so in the information I've been reading around local government's use of your windfall funding, basically, is really a caution around the recurring expenditures. So if you're deciding on projects that either establish recurring operating expenditures for you as a government, that has to be considered, or if you are funding items that you expect to continue funding for years to come, that's a really important consideration for that funding.
And I would think with this, with all of these, I mean, we would want to go ahead and these are priorities for us, put them into the budget, and then if we're able to utilize this other funding,
Yes.
then that could address that. But we
Yes.
would definitely want to go ahead and prioritize this.
And Commissioner Wills, that's definitely the direction that we're looking for you all, from you all today is your hope for us to include all of these items at these dollar amounts, and then we really need to work to see what, the revenue offset to that and what that looks like.
I guess my hope would be to, because broadband is, one of the only things on that list that's specifically listed, to maybe wait to have that conversation in a couple months when we get guidance from Treasury. And I don't know if, I had a few questions about the broadband one. I don't know if you want me to
Keep going.
throw those out. I think this was something that was discussed by the board last summer in terms of broadband expansion as a priority. So I didn't benefit from those conversations, so I have questions around that. But in terms of the $2 million, it sounds like it's a grant that was done through an RFP. So I'd like to learn more about that, what those funds are used for, what percent of the total cost the money goes to, who owns the infrastructure once it's built. Those sorts of questions are on my mind in terms of kicking the tires on that line item.
And we will bring that back to you, because you're correct. We did an RFP, and before we can award that, we are working through. We did have a broadband work group steering committee, and that Commissioner Wells has been gracious to serve on before she was a commissioner, so she was very involved in this even then. But we would bring that back to you before we can award a contract. So we would figure out those answers and negotiate with them and bring that to you now. But yes, we're working through that, and I'm looking at Tim to see, I believe that was in May, that we will come back to the board.
So there's already an RFP out, and now
It's already come back. So
Okay.
we're
So now we're just
actually
looking
going through
for-
that now and working through the details of that RFP, yes.
Which is really great timing with all this potential, because
Yes.
we're already very well positioned. So we definitely need to, in my opinion, prioritize broadband, keep this in the budget, and then obviously if we're able to use the extra funds,
Correct.
then we'd be able to do that. But we wouldn't want to kick this out of the budget right now and not have that placeholder when we have these requests for proposals and the potential to actually move that needle.
So again,
So, but this is, some of these items, it's a question mark. Can we use recovery funds for this or not? But broadband, we
clear.
can, right? I mean,
Right.
we actually
We
know
know,
the
yeah.
answer is yes. So
Yes.
we don't need to keep having a question mark around that one, right? We know we can do this.
that would be our suggestion, that this is clearly marked out.
Yeah.
We don't know the answer about the fiber, or what is that, the description or definition of broadband at this point from the funding
Yeah.
source, but we clearly believe that we can use that recovery money for broadband.
And this would be one-time money,
Correct.
although over 5 years or 3 years or however many years, if we decide to
Continue.
get to $10 million, and 10 million is the number we're shooting for.
That was our target when we did an in-house estimate for the 10 million. Our fees are coming back, and we're trying to negotiate at least to that 10 million that would be county funded over the 5 years. And Tim, if I'm saying anything wrong, you can absolutely correct me.
Okay, but now that we have the recovery funds, which we did not know we would have, but they have to be spent in 3 years.
Correct.
Right, so that is the thinking that perhaps we just accelerate this, since we have funding that's not gonna have to come out of the general fund for this purpose, but which in fact needs to be allocated sooner, and which of course we would wanna see the improvements happen sooner. So is the current thinking like maybe we're moving towards 3 years instead of 5 years?
For the broadband?
Yeah.
So the current thinking is, would you allocate 2 million or more of the 10 million for this funding from that 51 million? So if you were to say, we know it's 10 million, if you want to allocate the 3 years of 6 million from this, we could move that faster and spend that 6 million. If your decision would be we're only going to do 2 million, that's the 1 year funding for this year, then we will come back to the board in subsequent budget years to fund that gap between what you take from this funding source to get to the 10 million.
But you're asking
I
if you
guess,
could
I
just
guess my
use,
thinking is, and again, we haven't gotten into the bigger discussion around the recovery
Correct.
funds yet. Maybe we'll end up realizing, gosh, we've got $100 million worth of ideas here, and there's, I don't know how that's going to turn out yet, because we're just getting started. But I guess the simple way I was thinking about it was, why don't we spend $10 million, use all recovery funds, and do it in 3 years?
That's fine.
Yeah.
That would be one option, or you could take it, again, and use more recovery money for other options. But absolutely, our thought would be broadband is eligible, so we would not be asking you for the 2 million from general fund on this list. It's on the list because we collected all these data throughout the year, but our plan would be to set that $2 million aside, and you're actually looking at 1.9 from general fund right now.
Okay.
And the RFP that came back, is that for $2 million or for 10 over 5?
It was all over, it was from as low as, go ahead.
Tim has.
Rusty tells me I have a hot mic in multiple ways. So we received 3 proposals, and the range on those proposals varied substantially. But what we're doing right now is going through an evaluation process on those proposals. It is an active procurement, so I don't want to speak too much to the specific details or the vendors. But we did see a range on the costs, and we're negotiating those now.
Great. And the plan is to come back to the commission with a more detailed report in April or May?
Absolutely. As with any contract, we'd bring it before the board so that you could evaluate it, understand what you're getting for the dollars, what you're not.
Okay. The RFP that was done, just from reading the information that was in the packet, so it was mostly about rural broadband, right? There weren't any kind of like more in-town broadband investments as part of that RFP?
We actually, the RFP that was developed speaks to both. So we spoke to access, extending access into more rural areas where infrastructure doesn't exist. But we also had a very specific component of the RFP around affordability and accessibility, which tends to be what we think of as more of an in-town or urban issue. So the providers provided affordability options when they responded to the proposal, but we're continuing to evaluate those.
Okay, so there's different kinds of projects, some of which would be like in Asheville or other towns, and then there's the expansions in rural areas. That's all being looked at. Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. Other questions on this?
I'm excited about this list. That's all I'll say.
Are there others that are missing from this list that you thought about that we need to be thinking about for 2022 funding?
I'm excited about the list too. But I have one specific question. On the mountain mobility, Matt, so this is $259,000, but this would simply maintain current services. So this unfortunately would be having to spend money not to do some fun new things, but just to keep what we have. This isn't for Trailblazer operations, is it? This is for senior citizen mobility access. Could you just tell us a little bit more about what's at stake if we don't?
Sure. The mountain mobility funding that we have lost was actually occurred in 2021 as well. The funding generally supports elderly and disabled transportation assistance, employment transportation, and rural general public transportation. So that funding we have traditionally been able to reallocate to support elderly and disabled transportation. So generally what has happened with that funding in prior years, block grant supports the first several months of the year, so we seek that funding. Then we roll over into 5310, which is a competitive grant process matched with rope funding, and then when those funds run out, we use the balance of rope funding. So that gap is one of the least restrictive in terms of how it can be used outside of which the general population is, and it can be a match dollar to federal dollars. So it's a really unique type of funding that we receive, and the fact that it can be matched with federal funding, which is why a replacement would generally need to be local fund dollars. And the legislature actually enacted last year to remove that from the budget. We don't have any clear guidance about what they're going to do with that funding, which is why we budgeted that funding that we would normally have received at zero at this point in the year.
I think there was did I see a slide that has more details about this somewhere else in the presentation? I feel like I did. Okay, okay, right. I guess just on this item, right, so yeah, this is mentioned in this one-page handout. There's a paragraph on it. If we could just get a little bit more detail. I mean, naturally, I don't think any of us would excited about the idea of losing services, but just it is a lot of money. So if there could just be a description, perhaps going into a little bit more detail about if we didn't replace this funding, like exactly what does that service level change or whatever, just exactly what that would that look like, just so we are really clear on that point. That level of detail would be helpful to, I think. So other questions or comments at this time on these items? We are going to talk more about just kind of general use of recovery funds in a little while. So in terms of like, what are the commission's ideas or interest in that? That's going to be another chance to kind of talk about new things that we can do. But again, they're going to have to kind of fit within that eligibility for those funds. So in terms of just anything the county could do, if there's something that you might want to speak up for that's probably not going to be COVID funds, or recovery funds eligible. Are there other thoughts at this time?
2 or 3 things on my mind that I only thought about in relation to the ARPA funds coming our way, which I have no idea whether we could spend it on or not, but one would be a countywide transit master plan. Another would be funding for watershed restoration or stream restoration improvements due to all the increased flooding that we're seeing. If you drove around last week or at all, you might have seen some of that, which is only going to get worse. So that's something of interest to me to spend ARPA funds on. I don't know if we can, but perhaps something to add to this list. I have lots of more ideas that I'll save for our later conversation, I guess. But that's it.
I'm supportive of this list. It looks good to me.
Sorry, what was
sorry,
that?
Terry,
I said
could you
I'm
repeat that?
supportive of the list. It looks good.
Thank you.
I would say if there's other ideas that you really think are probably not going to be potential Recovery Act funds, then now's a good time to mention them. I've got several that I'm probably going to hold for that discussion because I'm hopeful that they're going to be Recovery Act funds. If the answer comes back, no, they're not, then I might want to kind of like pull them back into kind of like, all right, well, how else could we figure out how to fund them? But if it's something that, in all likelihood, only the county can fund it, I think now's the time to elevate it for discussion.
Okay, mine falls in your category.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
I
So
think
for-
mine are too.
So for
we'll
clarity,
hold on.
Brownie, for clarity then on Parker's 2, the watershed restoration and countywide master transit plan, you're adding this to this list to look for 2022 funding? Is that what?
You asked, are there things missing from this list? And so
Right.
I of course, jumped at the chance to respond.
Okay.
I'm hopeful that those one or both of those things might be something we can talk about in the ARPA discussion. Are we calling it ARPA?
Let's not call it that.
Okay.
It's actually the local recovery fiscal.
Local recovery,
yeah,
okay.
so.
Recovery funding.
There you go. So those two, you want to have that conversation later? I'm just trying to make sure that where we want to plant these things and start looking to fund them.
Yeah, they both seem like one-time expenditures, possible expenditures to me that I'd love to talk about local recovery funding for.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
I think those both sound like, important issues to be looking at. As with a number of other items, I think there's kind of this question around, do we put those into the comprehensive plan study process versus trying to do something, standalone? So I'll just kind of, and I don't have a personal opinion about that question, but I know that from a process standpoint, there's different ways of doing it, right? So, but again, if there are if we can do some distinct studies like that using recovery funds, then that might be a good way to do it. So, any other ideas right now for things that are likely not recovery funds eligible that folks would like to just, elevate for discussion at this time? Okay. I know there's some other information elsewhere in the presentation about this, so I'm happy to hold off for there. I know there's in some of the other financial documents, there's discussions about like some of the renewable projects that are on the radar screen for this year, and also what look kind of like placeholder numbers for future years. So that's going to come up in discussion later, or do we need to?
So this concludes my portion of the
Yes.
presentation, and I will turn it over to John Hudson, who's one of our budget analysts, who's been the primary lead for our capital planning project process. And then following that, Eric Grau with our IT department will be here to present information related to information technology recommended projects for fiscal year 2022. So that's where I would look for you to ask questions, or if the detail doesn't come out in that conversation, definitely ask the questions.
So I'll just I guess say at a high level now. I know there's a couple projects identified. They sound great to me, and some future placeholder numbers that we'll see for future fiscal years. The one thing I would say on the energy side is that I want us to make sure we have resources budgeted to basically plan future projects, right? Like these projects that like any of these other planning initiatives that we talk about for, water quality or transit or comp plan. It's all a lot of planning work, so I want to make sure that and there's staff time that goes into that. And then in some cases, there's also different kinds of expenses to actually kind of do early stage planning work. So I want to make sure we have resources to do those kinds of future projects, because a lot of these, like the plan we did last year, it took a couple of years to plan it. And other kinds of projects can also have long lead time. So I think we have to think about future. We're going to get to these goals. We have to have a pipeline of projects that actually happen. And so that's something I would say I want to make sure we're planning for as well. Okay. So, and I know there's some placeholder numbers in the budgets for those kinds of things. So, but I wasn't sure exactly how they're being envisioned in terms of just actual installation costs for doing something on a library or something else, or versus sort of planning resources. But I think this will come up again.
Yeah, there's a
in the
slide deck
discussion
on
later.
capital expenditures.
That's
I
right.
think is right.
That's right.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
All right, Jennifer, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yep.
So Commissioners, as we transition, if you want to take a quick break till, I think John needs to just get into Intel and.
Okay. Great. Let's take a 5-minute break that will become a 10-minute break, but not longer than 10 minutes for real.
A 2-minute break, not longer than 5, is that what you said?
2 that turns to 5.
Man.
Good afternoon. I'm John Hudson with the Budget Department. I'm here to talk about capital projects for fiscal year 22, as well as our 5-year capital improvement plan. Just as a reminder that what a capital project constitutes, that's a construction, renovation, or demolition project, or an acquisition of land or other assets valued at or above a threshold established by our capital review team, currently at $100,000. With a useful life of at least 5 years. This includes significant capital maintenance projects, and improvements to or expansions of existing assets must increase the appraised value or add to life expectancy to be considered capital project. So just want to talk through a bit our capital project process timeline for this year. We kicked off our capital process review on August 11th. We actually did training with all folks who were going to submit capital projects or might be thinking about it, in order to build their knowledge of what capital projects are and how they might best make their case for a capital project. We opened the date for those requests on August 17th. The capital review team also reviewed and revised our capital improvement policy and procedures last fall, and the copy of those that reviewed the policy and procedures was disseminated to you in the fall. November 20th, we closed the window for submitted requests, and the capital review team began their work on looking at those requests and deciding what we would bring forward to the budget process. So throughout December and into January, we heard presentations from departments of requests for capital, and then we convened a meeting near the end of January to have a recommendation and brought those recommendations forward to the county manager on February 18th. That capital review team is composed of the assistant county managers, the finance director, the budget director, our general services department director, and a series of other department directors who rotate on a semi-annual basis. So the recommended projects for the general fund for fiscal year 22 are as follows. There's a building automation system for the detention software that controls the HVAC system. The software is almost obsolete, so this is a important high priority project. A 911 backup center. We're discussing consolidation efforts with the city of Asheville between our dispatchers and their dispatchers. Regardless of how those consolidation talks go, Asheville currently provides a backup center for us. If we do not consolidate with Asheville, we will need a different space. And if we do consolidate with Asheville, we will need a larger backup space. So regardless of how those discussions go, we will need a backup center as that's mandated by state law. We have considered phase 2 of solar panel installation. This would be solar panels on the East Asheville Library and the firing range at the Public Safety Training Center, and where we held our last budget retreat. A paddle boat replacement for Lake Julian. An additional new restroom facility for the Buncombe County Sports Park. I believe that to accommodate the number of visitors they see at the park, that there should be yet another restroom facility. An upgrade at the Owen Park Playground. An accessible boat launch at Lake Julian. Bathroom additions at Lake Julian. Those bathrooms are old and aged, and there could be some concerns about the underground plumbing and such as we move through that project. The administration building, this building, the envelope repair, there was exterior job done on the windows last year because of leakage, and that uncovered more significant work to be done on this building. And so we're looking at about $2.5 million to repair that building, this building. And then we felt that there was a need for a dog park for the county. We don't have an existing dog park. And this is as part of the Anchor Destination Grant, a dog park would be put out at the Buncombe County Sports Park. Are there any questions about these recommended projects? You can see that what the funding nature is. Pay-go means pay as you go. That would be cash that we would take from the general fund and do an interfund transfer to the capital projects fund. And those items that say debt, we would go out for debt on and combine those with other projects on an annual basis when we have accumulated enough expenditures to go out for debt.
Thanks for this. Could you just share a little more context around the envelope repair of this building? Yeah,
sure.
thank you.
Let's see. So there were construction deficiencies in this building. What I'm told is that this building was not the best construction to begin with. The contractor who built this building
Amen to that.
is
You're
no
right.
longer in business, and apparently he built a couple buildings for Mission as well that have similar issues. But there's building exterior that has to be done with, the flashing was not installed properly, and it brings up some leakage issues. And so we need to eliminate water intrusion and air infiltration. That basically means that we're using a lot more energy for this building that we would hope not to.
Commissioners, if you recall, when Mike was here last, we actually did some discovery on the building because we thought the windows was what was leaking, and every time it rained, the building would leak. And when they pulled the exterior off, they realized that the flashing around the windows weren't completed. And then there was a lot of issues around with tie-ins as well. So we do need to do some significant repair work on the exterior envelope. The brick wasn't always tied in specifically. The ties they used were wrong at that time.
Do we have any recourse if the problem originated with the contractor?
The contractor's the contractor's no longer in business there. That's what I'm told.
What year was this built? 2010? So we're way past any statute of limitations on that. And we bought it basically at a distressed sale when he was going bankrupt after the 2008 financial crisis.
Is it on?
I think we
Okay.
should be ready.
And a lot in the community, I was still in banking then, a lot had some serious concerns and wondered why did the county buy this bill when we bought, when it, the county purchased.
I'm also told that the work would need to be done before a sale could occur if we're thinking of divesting the building at some point in the future.
What protocols do we have to make sure like this kind of thing doesn't happen on county capital projects? Like what kind of inspections process or other quality control does the county exercise to make sure we're getting a decent building or other facility?
I think we build a lot of that into our construction contracts now, and our general services department does put in language to protect us in those sorts of situations. But again, this was outdates most of the folks who are working in that group now, and so we would expect that through our contract language and through the contractors we work with, that we would be able to alleviate those concerns if they came up again.
Okay, other questions or feedback on these projects?
Yeah, I am curious about the sports park, the dog park, which I'm very supportive of the dog park, but I'm just curious, $80,000. What does it exactly entail that it takes $80,000 for a dog park?
That's the quote that was brought to us from the Recreation Services Department. They have to do a lot of grading. There's runoff involved when so that the water doesn't get polluted. That is the quote that they came up with, because I can come back with the details of the quote at a later point if you would like.
Okay, thank you.
I'd also be curious just where exactly it's proposed to be located at the sports complex too, just if there's a map or something that y'all could show us.
We can do that.
It's near the entrance when you first drive in. There's a National Greenworks orchard right there. I think it's across from that is where they're planning on the dog park.
So it's up kind of near the school.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before you get down into the.
Correct.
And
That's my understanding.
All right.
Are there any other questions about the recommended projects from the general fund for this year?
Yes, I'm just curious, as we start to upgrade playgrounds, are we making all of those accessible for all children?
As they are upgraded, they do look at ADA standards.
Thank you. It's important to me. Thanks.
I think this is a great list of projects. My only comment, kind of going back to what I mentioned earlier, is, I'm certainly for, looking at solar on these two county buildings. But, I'm just also interested in kind of like the future planning of other projects. To get to our goals, we're going to need to be doing really large scale projects, and just doing a couple of small installations each year won't get us to our goals, at least not on the. I'd like for us to get to our goals ahead of schedule. I think just, we'll need to be doing more than this annually to get to our goals. So it's part of the reason I want us to make sure we're thinking, we have the capacity to think about bigger projects. So I think we need some kind of subcommittee working on this, because there's a lot of planning work, and I think it's going to take creative thinking around how to do that. So I'm certainly supportive of these, but I also want us to have a process to make sure we're thinking about, what are all the different opportunities that are out there, which will, just like the last round, cost us some money to do, but in all likelihood will probably save us even more money. So I'm very supportive of these projects, but I also think I'm just interested in the kind of the process for planning for future projects this year and over a multi-year period.
Is it staff time that's the biggest limitation for just proposing these two at the moment, or what's the limitation to just doing 400,000 right now?
Well, we did have the large project, the initial project last year, and that project is progressing, but I think it is a lot about how much we can do at once.
In terms of staff bandwidth to work on
Yes.
implementing what we've already committed to and then thinking about future
Yes.
plans.
Something to talk about.
List.
Okay.
I'll just add that we do in future years in the CIP have funding for additional projects. And we are right now in the midst of hiring a project manager in the General Services Department. So that will enable us to take on more projects.
In the future, from what I was looking over in terms of future fiscal years, it's kind of similar to this, right? Like there's a placeholder of $400,000, which I appreciated seeing that, so that every year we would be doing something, right? But so I guess and I know since we don't have detailed plans, it's hard to budget something, when you don't have the plans developed yet. But if we really want to get to the county's internal 100% goal on the time frame that we've agreed to, and I'd really like to see us get there faster, then it's going to need to be a bigger order of magnitude than that, which I think does kind of go to how do we build the internal capacity to both execute successfully on what we've already committed to, as well as kind of think creatively about what are those future opportunities. So anyway, it's just some feedback, but I appreciate that we have committed to a big bundle of projects, and just following through successfully on that is going to be a lot of work for sure. So if there are other, the project manager sounds great. If there are other resources we need, either in terms of outside engineering support or internal capacity, I would certainly be open to hearing it. Any other questions about this list, or any other thoughts about capital or?
I do have one more slide of
Sure. Okay, go
projects
ahead.
for.
Sorry about that. Oh yeah.
These are projects for our solid waste enterprise fund. The enterprise fund is self-sustaining with the revenue, so the pay-go projects are well within their ability to cover, and they would go out for debt on the two larger projects. And these are projects that with the consistently growing amount of need for solid waste projects, we're meeting demand. And Dane, we are looking at a major construction of our Cell 7 municipal solid waste, and also our Phase 7 of construction and demolition. Those are his big debt projects. He's also looking at covering a gas collection control system expansion, a floor trailer for transfer station hauling, and 6 semi-trucks for transfer station hauling, as well as a compost feasibility study. So that Dane has also put together, that is in your larger packet, a 5-year plan of projects for solid waste. Any questions on these projects?
I had a few landfill questions. I guess maybe I missed the greater detail solid waste packet, but which I don't expect anybody to know right at the moment. But the Cell 7 expansion, that's a brand new cell that we would be constructing for the first time ever. And I would like to know how many tons a day or week of garbage that can handle.
We can get that information for you.
That'd be great. And I think you just spoke to it, the difference between the Cell 7 construction and the Phase 7 line items? What is that?
Well, the cell 7 is municipal solid waste, so household solid waste and such. But the construction demolition is to manage like building materials and waste from like
Okay,
construction projects and from development.
okay. I guess the same question for that then too is kind of what's the tonnage? That it can
We can
handle?
confer with
Yeah.
Dane and get that information for you.
Okay. And then the last, I think this is the last question. The cell 6 gas collection expansion. I assume the older cells are already collecting gas? Is a question that,
That's, I don't know the answer to that
Okay.
question. I do know with this specific situation that we are collecting gas and using it and looking for ways to repurpose it.
yeah,
So I will just say that, yes, we have an existing collection system. And so we're looking to expand that and collect more gas to go into that generator to generate more electricity.
Okay.
So,
I think where I'm getting at the end of the question here is if we're creating a new cell, would we not want to collect the gas from that as well? I guess is where I'm going.
yes, we would, and that's something that once we build that cell and we start filling it with waste, then we would build out the collection system as it grows.
I know something to talk about at a later time, but I know we talked about other alternatives and for that system and planning for the future and seeing $15 million worth of debt on this slide. Maybe having those conversations now would be
And there should have been a larger capital project packet you received. That's about 80 pages. And in that packet, you'll find the 5-year CIP that Dane's planned out for his solid waste department.
Okay.
And if you have further questions, we can take those out if you review that material and get back with you.
Thank you.
Will the cell 7 extend the life expectancy of the landfill?
Yes.
Until what year? Do you know?
I don't know.
Okay.
It's like 25 years is what we're anticipating at this point. So, I mean, of course, if we do more recycling and diversion, that changes things. There's lots of different factors in that.
And is that the last?
That's the last
Undeveloped
slide I
cell?
have. I can.
No, is that the last undeveloped cell at the landfill? So if this proceeds as
There
25
is-
additional years, what's the ultimate life expectancy of the
25
landfill?
years,
25 years.
that's for everything. And yes, there's some other undeveloped areas. But I'd have to get Dane in here to tell you where future cells are.
There is a cell 8 in his 5-year CIP.
So it could be further extended if additional investments were made at the overall property beyond 25 years.
No, that is the total life expectancy of the landfill. Once all the cells are built out, is approximately 25 years. But again, that's very variable,
Right. We can
based
change that
on,
number,
yeah.
Do we know how much landfill fees will need to be adjusted in order to accommodate the additional costs?
We are working on that for this coming year. We're going to be looking into that. So we'll have our internal staff evaluate these costs and how that impacts our revenue, or our need for more revenue, and we'll be presenting that to you.
We did when we did Dane's 5-year CIP, we did project out costs as well as debt projects in the future using a very conservative revenue figure, and we can still manage the projects he has on that list with a very conservative revenue.
Okay. But there is an expectation it will need to go up.
At some point.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I'm going to pull that up right now. So right here I have the 5-year general fund. This may be very hard to see. This is in your packet. And under the FY22 column, you can see all the projects that we've just discussed today. And there are placeholders. For some of these projects, I do have some details. Some of these projects are simply placeholders that we've been holding for a long time, and we don't have a lot of detail about what that project looks like.
Yep.
Okay.
Give us guidance on that, but we have a placeholder, so you know it's on the schedule. But there's no year right now assigned.
And just one comment on that, we had some discussion, I think this was before the elections though, I think. It's all blurring now. We had some discussions about the so-called aesthetic improvements that could be made on I-26, the new bridge and other aspects of the project. This is different than that. These are not these so-called aesthetic improvements. These are like multimodal infrastructure that DOT has agreed to build in the project. And in many ways, they cover most of the cost of it because like they're building this whole project. It's just like extending out to have walkways and some bikeways and stuff like that. But those, I guess under state policy, those incremental costs have to be at least partly covered through local funding. But I would definitely just speak up for this because it's kind of like when you're, like when roads have already been built and then you try to come back in like years later and put a sidewalk in, it costs like millions of dollars for reasons that are always hard to understand. But if you just build it when you're building the road, it's like basically you're paying for the extra materials. So I think this is a bargain for us as a community to get this multimodal infrastructure built up front when the rest of the project is included. So for those reasons, I think it's great that we have this in our budget, even though we're not exactly sure what future year it would actually happen.
And just,
Yep.
John, you had anything to say on this slide?
No,
And I wanted to bring your attention as well, because we are trying to plan out a 5-year schedule. So if you notice in '23, there's some big costs that are also coming that we want to think through. But wanted you to pay attention to this as you go through your packet, just to give some awareness around trying to get that 5-year look as you go into this. If there are things on that second year or third year that you believe needs to move forward or move out, please give us that guidance as well.
we also have to keep in mind of the comprehensive facility assessment and whether or not that will bring forward projects that may escalate in need.
I guess, this kind of goes to maybe the discussion about the recovery funds, but for the capital projects, like a lot of the recreational assets, I'm kind of working under an assumption that a lot of those probably will end up being eligible, right? Because you can make a good argument. These recreational assets will be used by people who visit our community. There'll be economic development benefits from those outdoor recreation assets and other amenities. So just as a high-level comment, I would say for the really good projects that are likely to be recovery funds eligible, I'd be very supportive of considering trying to move those forward and to consider use of recovery funds for those purposes. And again, the recreational ones to me kind of stood out as like, seems like we could make a good case for those. Maybe there's others as well.
We will look to our existing plans for projects like sustainability, like recreation, and even our facility plan that John mentioned. As we get guidance from the federal government, how we can spend that money, we will look to our existing plans to bring forward projects with you, as well as the projects that you're going to give us later today to consider.
A lot of tourists like to bring their dogs with them. So I think that dog park, I think we could probably make a good case on that one. I'm just brainstorming here. Pickleball would be big.
Is the Emergency Operations Center on this list in terms of heard rumblings about proposing a new facility?
That is, we do have upgrades to the Public Safety Training Center as a placeholder for Emergency Operations Center. We're still not sold on whether or not that's the best location for an Emergency Operations Center.
That's the castle?
No, that's the facility you were out at for the budget retreat.
That's the yes. Okay.
Tying in with what Brownie said, I agree with him about the recreation. Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I agree with him about the capital projects with recreation, and it makes me wonder about the mobile unit that you had here in '23, the 100,000 toward that, because it's the mobile HHS unit potentially, would you think that funding for that could work?
That could possibly be a funding because it's public health, and that would have helped us with COVID. So, yes, ma'am. We would first look to our capital projects that have already been laid out. We will look to the projects that you're developing now as part of how we would bring forward to you when we start spending that money. As soon as guidance comes out, then that can really help us focus on what is available.
We did discuss that project with HHS in terms of bringing it forward a year, and given COVID working them over a bit, they were prepared. They wanted to set on that till FY23 for planning purposes.
Okay, so they're not interested in bringing that forward even if the funding was available?
Remember, the funding goes through 2024, so we will still have time to do some of these funding.
I just feel there's some real benefit when you can get out in the community, and so there's a lot of potential with that.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. I don't think there's any other questions or comments at this time. So what's next?
The projects that are also on our list for funding.
Okay.
Would be presented for IT.
Thank you, Commissioners, for the opportunity to present today on the IT governance process for FY22. So what is the IT governance process? Well, it's a set of procedures and policies so we can make good decisions on our technology acquisitions for upcoming years. Predominantly looking at over $5,000 of costs. It is a committee of 10 staff members. 5 of those members are standing members, and that's the IT director, the 2 ACMs, the performance management director, and the budget director. And additionally, we have a rotating cast every 2 years, roughly from the different areas of government, HHS, culture and recreation, et cetera. And this year, this is their second term, but that's Stoney in HHS, Jim in libraries, Matt Stone, permits and inspections, Dane in solid waste, and Roger Presley is our public safety representative. Hidden slides in this deck. Excuse me. That's not the slide. There's a bunch of hidden slides in the deck, so I'm not sure how that happened. Well, I didn't put this deck together. So moving on, can we flip the slides up to the evaluation criteria, please?
Yeah.
There you go, Parker.
Yeah.
So last September, we had a bunch of project requests come in for these IT future projects. We had everyone submit a project request based upon answering questions around these 7 evaluative criteria. How does it align with our strategy, internal efficiencies, et cetera. That process was evaluated by the committee, scored, et cetera. And then recommendations were presented to Avril, the county manager, on what to move forward with and present for you today. The ACMs had a lot of say in that too, but by and large, the committee scored these projects based upon the criteria and presented them for recommendation. So similar to the capital, we were asked to put a 5-year project plan together. I'm sorry, this is pretty small, but I think you have it in your packet in front of you. I'll just go through these real quickly. So for FY22, the first one is the Office 365 backup solution. In fact, 2020 was a huge year of us going to Office 365 to support all the hybrid work and remote work and things like that. So it's a cloud-based solution. Like any of our data assets, we need to back them up and preserve them. We have now critical business processes in the cloud and Azure, and this is a backup solution for that. The Cobblestone Vendor Gateway, this is for our contract management system. This is a portal for vendors to register themselves. There's a lot of data we can capture with this process around equity and minority-owned businesses and making sure that we are reaching out to those businesses when we have RFPs. So this portal is going to allow some of that processes. The Public Records Request Management Tool, we have lots of public records requests every week. 3 PIOs in the county, general government, sheriff, and HHS has a PIO. This system has workflow and documentation around public records requests. You know, legal will have to sign off on certain branches. It's just putting a formalized process to our public records requests system. Power BI cloud service, another cloud solution here. We love our data and analytics in the county. We've been doing that mostly on-prem. But this solution allows us to integrate with all the Office 365 work we've been doing and collaborate and share outside of Buncombe County as well in a much more efficient manner and secure manner. So our other partner agencies, our community partners, this is a way that we can share and collaborate with data analysis. The next one is the big ticket item for this year. It's the enterprise budgeting tool. This is built into our ERP system. And right now, I think Budget can speak to this more than I can, but it's a spreadsheet process predominantly, and this puts it all inside of our ERP system and really focuses on lots of opportunities to refine the budget, make sure we are budgeting appropriately. The community engagement platform for the web. This is for primarily our CAPE team. There's lots of uses for community engagement platform, things like everything from participatory budgeting to feedback and, you know, what do you want to, let's talk about sidewalks or those kinds of things. So a real way to get community involved in government. The online customer relations portal, it's similar in this way. This is eventuality on this is going to be a full online service catalog. You can quickly search and find all the different services. I believe the first real push is around complaint management and things like that. So right now, kind of going in all different directions. This is a centralized portal. It'll get put into one of our case management systems, and these type of issues will be tracked holistically throughout the county. And then the last one that's for FY22 is it's called the paper cut print release terminals. This is self-printing essentially at our libraries, kiosk-based printing. Right now, it's a very manual process with our library assistants collecting money, working with the citizens to print. This is essentially self-printing. I'll go through these next ones just real quickly, but just maybe similar to the capital plan, 5-year plan. The IT 5-year plan is probably going to be pretty fluid as new things come up. Last year we did this process, and some things just ended up in different year this time around, different priorities, different changes. Fully expect new software and new hardware acquisitions to also be requested for next year. So we want to look ahead and just be mindful of this, but I would not say that these are set in stone for these years by any stretch of imagination. So for some of those, board and agenda management solution, faster upgrade, that's our fleet management system. COOP systems, that's continuity of operations. You can think of that as disaster planning. Food and lodging, we actually, our vendor in this space has been bought out, and we are going to need to migrate the system to one of our current systems, and that represents that. A few more cobblestone, that's our contract management system again, around vendor collaboration and e-signatures. Facility Dude, that's our facilities management system. WebEOC, well, that's for Emergency Operations Center. It's a platform to manage emergency operations. We currently use the state system, but this system would allow us to create our own events and manage those independently of the state. Tax assessment, combined personal and real property assessment. We currently have all of our personal and business property in one system and our real property in another system, and this is Keith's desire to consolidate those systems. A couple HR requests around training, LinkedIn Learning subscription for online content, as well as the Workday Learning module and LMS base managing training throughout the county. And then way out in FY26, the content management system. This is a replacement for our web. Currently our web is run by our CAPE team, very customized, great website, but the CMS allows more departmental involvement and approvals and allows departments to be able to maintain more of their content. And the last one here is the NC Fast Robot Process Automation. That sounds really fancy, but it's really a way to integrate with our NC Fast state system for document management purposes, trying to automate a lot of the very redundant work of the taxonomy of where the documents need to go. So that's pretty high level and pretty fast. These are county management's recommendations through the ITDC governance process. There is one more slide. There's a couple other funds that are at play here. The 911 fund, which is reimbursable. This is the emergency fire dispatch protocol tools. So when you call 911, it's a series of questions that they go through to help get the right response. We already have this in place for EMS and law. And then the last one is an interdepartmental case management system. This will be grant funded. This system is used by a lot of our community partners, like the Community Paramedics program is going to go in there for case management around that. Currently used by a lot of our diversion programs. So this is just an expansion of that system. So that was super quick. I want to be respectful of time. Any discussion, any questions? Happy to answer.
Doesn't look like it, so great job. I think you answered everyone's questions and presented very good information. So,
And as we mentioned previously, when we get guidance from the federal government, any money, any projects here that can get funded by that, we would move to that funding stream as well.
great. All right. I believe the last item on our agenda is a discussion about the recovery funds. So, Avril, do you have any information that you want to share first to kick us off? Hey, Rachel. Great.
And she's going to lead this conversation.
Terrific.
One of the things we mentioned to you previous, 460925. 460925. As she's getting that ready, one of the things we mentioned to you when we first heard of this money is the need for some positions that we would need to bring forward to help manage this. So on your agenda for the April 6th, you will see us asking for positions. That would give us a head start to at least get the job advertised, but we would need to get funding from them to pay for these positions. But we want to get the positions authorized that we can at least start recruiting, so we'll be ready to go come May when we hope the first set of money comes.
And the recovery funds can pay for those positions.
We don't have an answer for that yet, so we're hoping that we can actually advertise, but we don't have to fill the jobs until we know for sure that the money is there.
Isn't there some percentage that can be used for overhead, though?
We didn't see that in writing yet.
Okay, all right.
That's how it worked for the corona, the very first CARES money. So we're assuming it's the same process, but we didn't want to wait until May. We want to get started just to get the positions at least advertised.
Makes sense.
And so how many positions are you wanting to add?
We're anticipating about 3.
Okay.
But to follow up on that, we're asking for 3 positions, but we wouldn't all hire them at the same time. We'll try to stagger those out.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I think you will probably hear a theme when you ask questions. What our response is that we are still gathering information. There's a lot that we don't know. As a reminder, in case anyone is listening in who I have not yet met, my name is Rachel Nygaard, and I'm Strategic Partnerships Director for Buncombe County. And I visited with you a couple of weeks ago at a commissioners meeting on the topic of coronavirus local fiscal recovery fund. And we haven't learned a lot more since that time, but want to check back in with you and keep the process advancing. And in particular, open the floor for you all to have a discussion today about how these funds may potentially be used. So as a refresher, this is part of the acronym that Commissioner Sloan was using earlier, part of the bigger fund that was approved, passed by Congress and signed by the President, called the American Rescue Plan. This particular piece of funding is called Coronavirus Local Fiscal Recovery Funds, and Buncombe County's estimated allocation as part of this fund will be approximately $50 million. You can see the number written on the screen, between $50 and $51 million. That's still an estimate that we're getting from NACO, which is the National Association of Counties. We should see our first funding received from that, half of it, by mid-May, with the other half to follow within the next year. We're repeating for you the specific language that is in the bill, and that is the only language that we have at this time to use to determine what is eligible for use of the funds. To refresh, these funds can be used to respond to the public health emergency and its negative economic impacts. And there's some examples, including assistance to households, small business, and nonprofits, aid to impacted industries such as tourism, travel, and hospitality. There's an eligible use of funds to support workers who are performing essential work, including premium pay. Item 3 is related to providing government services and can be used for revenue replacement. And finally, called out specifically in the bill is use of funds for infrastructure projects like water, sewer, and broadband.
Can I ask one question on that?
Yes.
Rachel? So it specifically names water, sewer, and broadband. But is the language, I mean, is there some potential that it might be a broader set of infrastructure, or is the sense that like those were the infrastructure pieces that were specifically named? So probably, other types of infrastructure, probably not.
Other types of infrastructure, probably not. We're going to look at guidance in a second. And capital is an area where there are some questions that have been posed to the U.S. Treasury about allowable use of funds for capital. We look at the language that's here and interpret it. The number 4 is really explicit, where it states necessary improvements in water, sewer, and broadband. It's written differently than number 1, which has the use, it says including, meaning those items that are there are sort of for examples, but that item is more restrictive in its writing. But again, we're just reading what we have right now and trying to interpret based on a limited amount of information.
I think I read NACO's guidance that said, in reference to number 1, that list was not meant to be exhaustive, that it most certainly means other things.
Yes, and I'll get to the NACO item in just a second. Let me talk about the Buncombe process for this. So we talked to you about having a 60 to 90-day planning process. That's ambitious. Part of that will depend on how quickly this guidance gets turned around to us, and we have more instructions. So we begin today with hearing from the Board of Commissioners about priorities, potential projects that could be covered with the funds. Our next stage is to gather ideas from departments. We talked about looking at the IT list, the capital list, other projects that departments may be aware of and want to submit, from community partners and the general public. Our planning team met yesterday and discussed using a survey for the general public, and then potentially later on in the process, an invitation, like more of an RFP style structure, to get ideas from eligible nonprofit organizations. This is all still quite in development. Nonetheless, once we've got all of the priorities in, we will run them through a prioritization process using a standardized scoring criteria. That's similar to the process that we use for the last 2 topics you heard about, like when we're looking at IT investments, capital investments. We would have a team and a predefined set of criteria, which we'll visit later, but would include things like, I think I've got a slide that will cover this, but time frame of the project, leveraging of additional funds, tie to our strategic plan, the results of the equity impact analysis of each project, and then be able to come back to you with projects to launch as early as the start of the new fiscal year. And I'm skipping over the staffing item because the manager just referenced that. So, guidance needed. We provided you a copy in your packet of a letter that was penned by NACO, the National Association of Counties, and submitted to the White House and the U.S. Treasury. They came to their constituents across the country, the 3,000 plus counties that they represent, and surveyed us about what we would like to get some clarity on related to the funding. We submitted our responses, as did many others across the country, and they collected it up and looked for themes and produced this sort of request that went forward asking for guidance. And you can see some of the categories listed on the screen that were included in that request. Earlier, there was a small discussion about broadband. We need some definition of what broadband means within the context of this particular bill. Capital investment, equipment and software, some more definition around aid to impacted industries and assistance to households, some more definition around education projects. Those last three that I mentioned also have funding coming their way from other sections of the American Rescue Plan. So that's another component that we are, and state funding in some cases. So sort of triaging and watching once we've got our collection of potential ideas, not only what is eligible for use of fund within local fiscal recovery funds, but what is most in need of fund in terms of maximizing other potential funding sources, whether they emanate from the American Rescue Plan or other sources. So considerations, I was just touching on this, wanting to make sure that there's alignment with the strategic plan priorities. We're in year one of a 5-year strategic plan as a county government and have that laid out for us, priorities that are both community focused and foundational focused. So outside kind of Buncombe County as a community, and then internal Buncombe County as a governmental entity, and want to have balance so that we have projects, a portfolio of projects representing both areas, considering equity and equitable outcomes and support for most impacted populations, considering intergovernmental collaboration. We mentioned before, municipalities are getting local fiscal recovery funds, other counties are getting these funds, states have funding, and so are there ways to come together across jurisdictional boundaries on projects? The need to prioritize one-time expenditures versus recurring or ongoing costs, because these are one-time funds that end at the end of the calendar year 2024. Before we go into the open discussion, wanted to just let you know that in your packet, you've got a copy of these slides. There's a reminder here of what was included in the strategic plan. In Buncombe 2025, these are the priority areas, including the focus areas and goals within that plan. Reminding you also of the budget priorities that you had articulated during the December planning retreat. That was when the board did an activity to rank priorities, and so these are listed in order of that ranking. And finally, the place that will pause the slides and open for conversation is this kind of initial brainstormed list of potential recovery fund priorities. This was populated based on informal conversations that we've heard between when we heard this funding had been approved and was coming our way to now. This is really just to get the conversation flowing. you all have a few ideas that came to the table already during this conversation, and staff have taken note of those suggestions. And you all have also expressed that you've come in with some other ideas. So I spoke with the chairman in advance, and I think that this would be a good time for me to pass to you, and you facilitate that conversation. We'll be here to listen and then wrap up at the end. Is that good?
That sounds great. Sounds great, Rachel. Sure.
I'm
All
just
right.
going to grab a notepad. Be right back.
Yeah. All right, so thanks for teeing all that up, Rachel. And I know that in our conversations earlier, we've already some of these ideas have kind of been surfaced a little bit, but we wanted to have time to just talk about this further in case there were other ideas that didn't kind of percolate up through some of the earlier agenda items. So, and we've heard about the process we're going to go through, so we're still very much on the front end of this. Still don't know there's going to be a lot of things that we are just not going to be 100% sure yet if they're eligible, but I think the purpose here is just to kind of like, let's get other ideas on the table, and then hopefully a lot of them will be eligible and can at least be in the mix of consideration for how we invest this. This is very unique. Probably none of us will see something like this again during the time that we are serving in this elected capacity. I have done this for a while. I've never seen anything quite like this. So we need to invest these funds really strategically in ways that people will look back and realize like that made a real difference. Whether people agree with this or don't agree with it, that we invested it in a really impactful way that really changes stuff for the future. So anyway, let's just, I'm just going to open it up, and this is going to be kind of a discussion. I want to make sure everyone has a chance to put any ideas forward. Who would like to? I want to kick us off for either commenting on some of the ideas that are listed here, or adding additional things that maybe have not already been identified.
Well, I'm willing to start.
Go for it, Terry.
Each section or just brand new? How did you want to proceed?
I would just say, for folks who have feedback, just feel free, if it's commenting on some of the ideas that are up here, feel free to just share your comments of, like you want to really, express support for some of the specific ideas or add something new. So I think it'd be pretty open-ended, whatever comments can flow. I think we have time to get all the ideas on the table.
So I'll start with, I think we've already discussed broadband. That seems to be a really clear fit. And I would say affordable housing too. I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to do something with those projects, because it's my understanding we've got some really good projects before the Affordable Housing Committee, and we don't have all the funding for those projects. So I'm really hopeful that we can move that forward in a meaningful way as well. Also, the utilities, energy efficiency, I'm really interested in exploring some with that. I know Commissioner Sloan had some really good ideas around that. So I think there's potential there for really helping people, because utilities were something that were really, anything we can do to keep people in their homes and have affordable housing, affordable utilities, all of that seems really important. Also, Commissioner Sloan mentioned the Transit Master Plan. I feel like I'm hopeful that this is a good place that we could proceed with that as well. And education, workforce development, apprenticeships, I really feel like if there's some way we can do that, because we're working on bringing all these businesses here, right, to improve good paying jobs and employ people. And I just really feel that we don't want to miss that opportunity, that we really need to make sure that we're doing the outreach, especially to our high school population, and making sure that they're going to, be ready for these jobs and know about these jobs and all that. So anything we can do around that potentially, I'm hopeful will be a good fit. And just a couple other things, just in general, when we think about, I think Chairman Newman mentioned earlier, kind of that recreation, I think about aging in place, which is one of our strategic priorities. So when we can do things out in the community so people can age in place, I think that's really beneficial. And anything we can do to support a resilient and healthy food system as well. I think that's one of the things that really came to light during this pandemic as well, is very important to our community. Thank you.
Robert, do you want to go? We can just. Okay. Well, Commissioner Wells, those are exciting ideas. There's two I'd like to zero in on. One is this on? Is this working?
Yep.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah.
One is just what's listed there is figuring out whether there's a way to expand access to quality early child education, perhaps doing that combined with affordable housing projects. And I know this would be limited to capital expense, but there actually are some capital needs on the near horizon as we think about the need for new early childhood facilities and them being located near affordable housing and public transportation is always so key. So lifting that up. We also, just to flag, we have a lot of moving pieces right now around the local early child education system, including scenarios in which some current providers would be displaced and have a very quick and urgent need for new facility space. So just like to kind of keep that in all of our minds as we move forward in the months ahead to ensure that by August, we are sort of landing at a place where we're expanding access to preschool and pre-K rather than seeing any loss whatsoever at the whole county level. The second one is shifting gears a bit and going to resident well-being. And I'd like to just paint a broad picture and then drill down to the areas where I think there might be some eligible capital expenses. What this relates to is really the extraordinary crisis we see in our community that's been exacerbated by COVID-19 at the intersections of mental health issues, homelessness, and addiction. I know that anyone who spends time in the downtown corridor area is experiencing each and every day and seeing in a very human way the crisis of that and the heartbreak of that. By the time I get to work in the morning, I've passed 2 homeless camps, one near my kids' daycare, one in a park across the street from our house, and also often walked by several homeless folks who are leaving the Code Purple shelter that's just across the street from us. And the level of suffering and need is just so profound. So I don't think this is news to anyone. It's been a major issue in our community for a long time, but during COVID-19 has, I think, moved into the level of a different kind of crisis, both for the people involved and the agencies responding, and also the systems that we're looking at, particularly the very difficult cycle to break of folks getting arrested or picked up or having a 911 call, and the only places where they can be brought are the ER or the jail, neither of which is really an appropriate place for a lot of people, for someone who's in mental health crisis but may not need to be hospitalized, or for someone who's caught in cycles of addiction and what they really need is help and services. So that's just sort of painting context a bit. The place where we get to, I think, some really critical and transformative opportunities for interventions that could help people and help our community, probably ultimately save resources, are on basically how our public safety systems and our other systems respond to folks in that level of need. So there's really sort of 3 buckets I'd like to talk about. The second and third bucket are where we get into the capital expenses. But the first is that, as we've seen in the early pilot stage of the community paramedic program, there's a tremendous need and critically, incredible things happen when a person who's in mental health crisis is responded to by a community paramedic who's trained to work with them and help get them to the resources and services they need. As we think about reimagining public safety, that's part of one of the exciting conversations we've been having, is getting to a place in our community where anytime a 911 call calls in from any jurisdiction where there's a mental health crisis, someone who's overdosed, or someone in an addiction-related crisis, a community paramedic could be dispatched, potentially with law enforcement as well if that was warranted from a safety perspective. So I think there's a trajectory there around the scale-up of that program. Some of those are salary and benefits costs, but there also are some capital costs like vehicles and technology that could perhaps be supported through federal funding. The second piece is, well, what happens once that response call happens? Where does someone go? As we said, the ER and the jail tends to be where someone goes right now, and that's the right fit for some people from a safety and health perspective, but for a lot of people it's not, and they will bounce out almost immediately. For those with the most urgent needs, I think there's an opportunity to create a behavioral health urgent care or a mental health urgent care facility that actually has more advanced clinical capabilities so that they could assess and treat people who had mental health crises. Maybe they need to get back on medication. Maybe they need a place to be stabilized for a while, but they don't need to go to the ER. That hasn't existed per se in our community to date, and we've seen, again, lots of people just bouncing and cycling because they have needs too serious to be treated on the street, but not serious enough to warrant a hospital admittance. So the term for this is sort of mental health or behavioral health urgent care, but having the clinicians on staff who can respond to the full range of needs that might show up. And then the final piece of this is probably the largest piece from a capital perspective, and it would be creating a high access, sometimes the term has been used as low barrier, but I've been educated that the preferred term is high access shelter that's open 24/7 and has wraparound services on site. And this is basically a place where folks could go who need a warm place to stay, and it could be a bridge into the kind of services that they need and deserve, whether it's around getting access to medication-assisted treatment, getting access to housing resources, or other needs, other basic needs they have. And certainly we see that something like this would address, would help us begin addressing more of the root causes and address some of the issues like the camps that we see springing up all over the community because people just don't have a place to stay. The Code Purple shelter that operates at my church next door has been, I think, showing us what's possible and the need for this, and it's been working really well by all accounts. And then there's still a lot, they get full very quickly, so the need far exceeds the capacity of doing this in a sort of stand-up way at a church. So been talking for a bit here, but this is a big project. It's one that folks on the ground and the front lines of this work have been advocating for many, many years, and I think in this unique moment we're in, we have a chance to hopefully to do some transformative work in partnership with the city of Asheville, who I know is very invested and engaged in these conversations, and then many community partners as well. And just want to thank, I think pretty much everyone at the commission has been involved in some level of discussion around this and doing ride-alongs and trying to get our head around what this might look like in recent weeks, and staff as well.
All right, great. Thanks, Jasmine. So let's just keep getting kind of ideas on the table. I think there'll probably be some follow-up questions and discussion, but let's just kind of keep getting stuff out there. So who would like to go next?
I'll go.
Go for it.
Yeah. I'm going to jump. My list is not in any order, so I apologize in advance. I guess first of all, looking at the slide, for whatever reason, when I made my list, I didn't think about education-related activities as qualifying under these funds, but we just don't know. So, I will give a shout out to brick and mortar infrastructure for early childhood education, as well as anything related to K-12 or community college infrastructure in support of STEM education or workforce development, that sort of training. I think I saw on our facilities study one of the buildings that's in the poorest shape that the county owns is the West Asheville Library. So I see new libraries on there. So that's something to consider. But I'll jump to my list. As Commissioner Wells said, we do have a number of affordable housing projects that we don't quite have enough funding for, so that's an exciting possibility. There's other potential projects and properties, like Ferry Road that are in the back of my head, or future development on government-owned land for affordable housing. That would be an exciting transformational use of these funds. One thing that I think the state and federal government through CDBG has been doing since I was born is a failing septic tank sewer extension program. I think the state spends a few $1 million a year. Essentially, you just find low-income persons with failing septic systems, and if they're in proximity to sewer, extending them. So that would be, in terms of shovel-ready, a really easy and quick use of funds that can help out, low-income folks that aren't going to get connected otherwise. Turning to weatherization and energy efficiency, another really exciting opportunity. You know, in the past, we've spent really small dollars on weatherization for fixing windows and cracks in roofs and that sort of thing. This could be an opportunity to really spend, you know, a couple $1 million on whether in the form of grants or no interest loans to upgrade, you know, large scale appliances and hardware in low income persons' homes, whether it's an HVAC system or a hot water heater, those really energy intensive appliances. And then on the commercial side, there's a lot of opportunity to, you know, renovate commercial kitchens, do rooftop solar, other energy efficiency in commercial properties as well. So that would be something to look at. Again, whether in the form of a grant or I don't know if revolving loan programs would be something that they would let us set up under this. What else? What else? Yeah, in terms of, in my head, drawing a direct line from, quote, economic impacts of COVID, you know, where that takes me is AB Tech and our small business incubator and ways to really support and lift up entrepreneurship in our community. So I don't necessarily have particular program ideas in mind, but if there's any, I guess, again, one-time expenditures that could aid in that, that seems like a no-brainer to me. What else? There's a few dozen miles of greenway in the in Buncombe County that has been planned and thought out. You know, I know that's something that we really need to think about holistically and on an annual funding basis. But there are small segments that this could be an opportunity to help fund and help pool dollars together. I think I'll say one more thing and I'll stop talking. I mentioned watershed restoration, stream bank restoration. As our community rapidly develops, especially in the urban areas, you know, we're losing trees, we're adding impervious surface. So flooding is getting worse, and also with climate change, our storms and the quantity of storms is getting worse. And so it's just gonna kind of snowball in terms of the problem, and it's even turning into a potential emergency in areas like Swannanoa River Road, where the Swannanoa River is eroding the soil underneath the road itself. And so I really kind of think this could be an opportunity to invest in watershed restoration. There's the Central Asheville Watershed Restoration Plan that was put together by RiverLink, has a really detailed list of potentially shovel-ready projects. I think it totaled $1.5 million. That's the kind of thing that I think you could do kind of in that area or county-wide. It's also the kind of thing we should probably consider as a county spending a couple $100,000 on a year or every couple of years to improve stormwater, rain gardens, swales, stream restoration, that sort of thing. I think could go a long way in creating a more resilient community. Yeah, and then just final thoughts. If there's any way we can any of these programs leverage other funds. I think others have mentioned that. You know, there's a state sewer extension program. There's other funds for weatherization, broadband, all these kind of things. If there's ways that we can think strategically about partnering with other agencies, of course we should consider that. I think that's it. I talked enough.
All right, thanks, Parker. Who would like to go next?
I'm happy to go next. These are all great ideas, and not to reiterate every single one of them, but when I think about affordable housing and education, there does seem to be an intersection with the two in terms of community well-being. So figuring out, in my mind, how we look at those two is almost incredibly intertwined in terms of helping benefit our community, I think is really important. I think we have the opportunity to do that with Berry Road in particular. But I don't want to continue thinking about these two issues as isolated and siloed from each other. So I think we have some opportunity there. In terms of our workforce training, we also have an opportunity to retrain and retool people's skills to get them into the jobs that are currently available that we know are also well-paying jobs. But the overarching thing that I want to make sure that we're keeping in front of us at all times is we know that the virus has most adversely impacted our communities of color and people of color. We've declared racism as a public health crisis. This pandemic is a public health crisis, and those two things really intersect in my mind as we think about each one of these ideas, the bullets up there. I want to make sure that we're keeping our eye on the equity piece and ensuring that we are serving throughout these projects the most vulnerable, most impacted members of our community who have been impacted by COVID-19, whether it's their own health, loss of their own jobs. And then we talk about the education component as well. We know that, as I've said before, our kids typically have a summer loss. We're looking at 13, 14 month plus loss with our K-12 and even into higher ed, I think. And how do we look at utilizing funds to assist those most vulnerable children in our community so that they don't fall further behind, but they have the opportunity to catch up. I'm also thinking, as we talk about our racial equity action plan, we know that there's community input sessions coming up. I think we could certainly sit here all day and say, well, we think this would be best for our communities of color, but I'm really hopeful throughout those planning and input sessions that we start to hear from them too what would help them recover from COVID-19. So I think all of the things that we've talked about certainly have that opportunity, but I want to make sure that we are not forgetting that and our most vulnerable, marginalized members of our community.
Great, thanks, Amanda. All right, I think we've spent the money several times over already, but we're not done yet, so I want to make sure everyone's got a chance. So, Robert, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, instead of repeating everything that's been said, Parker brought up a very good point that the water sewer. We have some areas out that, with myself and Al on the MSD, that we could at least do a partial. It's very expensive, to get that out into our rural area. And then environmental, how much it would help there. So echoing everything else, but I'm glad to see that's up there, and maybe, I know it's very expensive, but I think it'd be very beneficial in the future of here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mr. Whiteside?
Yeah, I purposely waited the last. Let's see, how much time do we have? No, I agree with everything that we talked about, but one of the concerns I still have, when we talk about education, we talk about housing, we talk about jobs, folks, we aren't doing a darn thing to really attack systemic racism in this community, and we've got to. And one of the ways we've got to make sure that, we can't build out affordable housing. We can't, forget it. But what we've got to start doing, and I'll just use that as an example, is using affordable housing as temporary housing. And by that I mean when we move people into these affordable housing complexes, we need to give them the training, the education, and everything that they need to make them taxpayers rather than tax takers. Because these people don't want to be stuck in that rut from now on, the way it's happening now. When I talk to a family, in the 5 generations they've lived in Hillcrest Housing, that's a crying shame. It's no excuse for that. But we've got to be more deliberate in what we do. You know, we do a good job in this community of talking about it. We do a little here and we do a little there. But we've got to be serious about what we are doing. Because what really I've seen during this pandemic, it's really uncovered the sores of our community. We can't hide them anymore. We've got to do something about it. And when we look at what we're doing, you know, in environmental, energy, stewardship, everything, our 4 pillars. But folks, if we don't deal with the core problem in this community, it's still systemic racism, we're not going to get anywhere. And when you talk about small business support, African American businesses, it was more when I was a kid in this community than it is today. So what that tells me, we're going backwards, we're not going forward. But as elected officials, we're going to have to take the lead in this. And we've got to be strategic, we've got to be serious about it, and it can't be window dressing. Because that's not going to get us where we need to go. And sure, in some places it's going to cost. But look at what it's going to cost us if we don't do it. Look at what it's cost us already. When you look at our health system, look at our schools, the achievement gap that we have in the city is just unreal. And in the county, if you look at the gap, I'm sure it's the have and have-nots. It's the same thing. It's not that much different. But I want us to be strategic, to really look at what we're doing. And let's not try to bite off everything. We can't do it. But let's take the important pieces of this pie and try to bite them off one at a time. And hopefully 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we'll be where we need to be. But let's just do, I don't want to see this $50 million come in and we blow it. What good is it? You know, it's a windfall. And I'm like you, Brownie. We won't see this in our political lifetimes. I hope we don't run into anything like this again. But, you know, and when we look at that, this is what we've got to think about. You know, let's make sure that we put this to work so that it will help us build a foundation that we can build on. But that's it. I know I might not have said anything, you know, specific, but it's time. Somebody's got to be the conscience of our community. And we've got to step up and do it. And it's affecting all the people in our community. You know, I always say this, it's an old saying, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So folks, we've got a weak chain in our community, and we got to strip it. But I'm through.
All right, thank you, Al. Thanks everyone for your comments on this. I've got a few things I wanted to add, maybe a few things that have been mentioned I just want to kind of echo, I guess. And I think it's great that some of these initiatives that we've already been working on and doing planning on are, seem clearly eligible under the recovery funds, like the broadband, of course, seems
yeah.
It's great that we've already been working on doing planning around that. Obviously, I'm supportive of that. We didn't know we would get $50 million, at the time this broadband work was being done. So it sounds like there's some different opportunities that have already been identified through that. But perhaps we can take what we've learned from what's already come in, and now that we know there's potentially more resources to apply, maybe look at some other opportunities. And I'm glad we're looking at both the rural and the kind of in-town needs around that. So I'm excited about seeing some real stuff get built through some of these funds. Not necessarily in order of priority, but just in the order I've kind of got them listed here. One of the other, one idea that I heard mentioned that I thought sounded like an interesting idea is, there are some significant new tax credits that are refundable, cash tax credits for families in nationwide. That are new policies. I'm not super familiar with all of them, but one of the things I've heard is that there's going to be a great need to make sure all of our residents are fully educated about that, and to make sure that people who are families that are eligible for it are able to access that. So again, I'm just kind of repeating something I've heard. I'm not sure how true all this is, but perhaps there'll be a need for us to invest in efforts to just fully educate the community to make sure all of our residents are able to benefit from some of the new national policies that are out there that can benefit families in Buncombe County. So I just wanted to relay that as one idea I've heard from the community. I definitely am very supportive of the high access, low barrier shelter concept that Jasmine spoke about. Related project, related but distinct, another project idea that's been talked about in the community for a long time around the idea of ending chronic homelessness and the hardest to house of the chronically homeless population. Homeward Bound's been kind of working on development of a project with that idea in mind for a number of years. There's been a number of sites looked at that did not, had issues, did not come through, but there now seems to be a very promising project to help advance that. Because it is focused on homelessness, it seems surely that would be an eligible project. So I'm very supportive of the county, playing a strong supportive role in that project in particular. Getting that up and going. I'm really appreciative of the kind of the look at the achievement gap issues and the pilot project idea that was mentioned in the staff report, looking at this model, this REACH model. I think it's very interesting, and I'm supportive of that. I mean, it's one of those projects where, if we probably could utilize recovery funds for that, is my hunch. If the pilot project is successful, it's probably something we're going to want to continue. So on the one hand, it's kind of a pilot project by its nature is short term, but if it's successful, it'll probably turn into a long-term project. So are recovery funds the best use of it versus county funds? I don't have a strong opinion about that at the moment, but I just, but whichever way we need to do it, I'm very supportive of that, because as Al said, if we're not trying some new things to tackle these longstanding problems, then I think we just have to do that, because there's a lot of good work that's done in this area, but it's obviously not been enough to make the difference that we want. So I'm very supportive of that. My hope is that if we do a pilot project around that, it seems like the kind of initiative that could very well draw in a lot of private support as well. So my hope is that if the county helps, maybe the county helps launch this effort, and if it is successful, we're going to want to help sustain it, but hopefully bringing in a lot of other partners with additional resources to help scale it up beyond a pilot project to make a bigger impact if it is as successful as we hope it could be. On the topic of affordable housing, I really, really hope that the guidance that comes back is that affordable housing kind of in general, not just homelessness, but just the need to address affordable housing with capital, through capital projects, does end up getting deemed eligible. I mean, since utilizing funds to help people with housing needs is identified as eligible, my hope is that it's not limited to simply rental assistance or paying back, rent or something like that, but that actually building some new projects does end up being identified as a permissible purpose. If it is, I would be very supportive of that being a meaningful percentage of the recovery funds, investing a meaningful percentage of the funds into that purpose. The Affordable Housing Committee, as it's been mentioned, we've got an unusually strong group of projects that have applied for funding to the county, which we won't be able to fund all of them just with our typical funding, so that would allow us to do more. And I think with like the Ferry Road property or other public properties, I think my sense is that there's a long enough window here that we could, if we determine how much funding we would want to apply to this need, there's probably time to actually think about doing some new projects, with this and getting them started and getting funds invested. So if it becomes a permissible use of funds, I'm very supportive of trying to really really make a big impact on that issue. In terms of small business support, I think the things that the county did with our partners during the One Buncombe Fund process, I think those were in the big scheme of things, it was a modest amount of funding, but I've heard very, very good feedback from that. I think it was I think it did have a meaningful impact. And I'm definitely open to allocating additional funds for similar purposes. I mean, there were probably lots of good applications that were not able to be funded with the modest amount of funds that we had appropriated ourselves. So looking at trying to do more to support small businesses in a really efficient way, not a lot of red tape, maybe still relatively small amounts of money, but for a lot of our small business owners and sole proprietors and minority-owned businesses or people who want to start a business and grow their equity in the community. I think those are exciting opportunities to think about. I would also kind of echo what Parker said around some of the greenway projects. It seems like those would be eligible. They clearly identify, tourism, restoration as a permissible use of funds. We all know that that's kind of our outdoor assets are among our best assets. So if there are some projects that are pretty shovel ready and some additional funding can help us actually go get things built, then I would love to see that happen. One other just really specific idea that was shared with me recently, I don't know who else on the commission might have heard about this or not, is something that I just really recently came to my attention. There's a piece of property that AB Tech is interested in that is basically like the property is surrounded by other AB Tech properties and it's been under a long-term lease. The lease is coming up. They are interested in acquiring it and basically utilizing, there's a building on it and utilizing it as like a new workforce center is the idea that I've heard kind of talked about what the purpose of that would be. So the idea would be, that there's actually lots of really good jobs in the community that don't get filled. And so this could be kind of a facility where employers could come in, do interviews with interested candidates, which might be AB Tech students, but it could also just be anybody in the community. They don't necessarily have to be an AB Tech student. So that's kind of this new concept I've heard just recently kind of brought up. So I just wanted to kind of share that. I think it's a conversation AB Tech is interested in talking to us about. Maybe because it's kind of got this workforce element to it, perhaps it could be ineligible for these kind of like economic recovery funding. If it ends up not being eligible for that, but the commission and AB Tech think it's a good idea, perhaps there's other ways we could approach it as well, utilizing the sales tax revenues or some other purpose. I just wanted to kind of put that out there as kind of a new project idea that I became aware of. All right, I think those were all of the things I wanted to just kind of underscore or add to the mix at this time. So I'll stop there. Are there any follow-up questions? I think everyone's had a chance to kind of share their ideas. Are there any kind of follow-up questions or discussion now that everyone's had a chance to sort of speak?
Yeah. Yeah.
Thought would be, I remember, what was the 2009 recovery plan called?
ARA, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act.
That, I guess that along with Tiger, they had their own kind of branding and logos and that sort of thing. I don't know if that's going to come out for this, but one thing I was thinking about on the drive over today was just whatever becomes eligible, whatever we spend these funds on, branding it in a way and communicating to the public how it was paid for and connecting it back to this pot of funds, I think is not in the top 3 priorities in my mind, but one of the priorities I would hope we would figure out a way to implement, actually communicating to the public.
All right, any other questions or comments? Rachel, Avril, any other questions or comments from staff at this time?
Yeah, I have a brief wrap-up when
Yep.
you're ready. Avril, did you have anything?
Go for it.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention direct COVID response. That didn't come up in the commissioner brainstorm around priorities, but it is an allowable use of funds. We have fully expended our coronavirus relief funds, and as we receive funding from sources like the state public health department through agreement addenda, we evaluate where those funds can be applied and are using funds essentially as quickly as they're becoming available for direct COVID response, for what was the testing initiatives and now the focus currently being vaccine. And so at this time, it's too soon to say what methodology we would use to define an amount needed, because we're still assessing all of both the expenses as well as what revenues could be available to cover them. But just want to keep that on your awareness that some portion of these funds we may recommend be used for direct COVID response. And so putting that out there before we move on.
And so any future expenses we could use to cover those purposes. Can we also get reimbursed for past COVID expenditures that the county has had to make, which weren't already covered through CARES funding or things like that?
I don't know that answer, but we'll make a note of it. And,
Okay, great.
follow up. Yeah.
Well, great.
So just quick note on next steps. We don't know when we're going to receive the guidance from U.S. Treasury, but that's top on our list of next steps. We're going to be coming back to you to talk about staffing positions to support the process and administer the fund. We will be conducting engagement with county departments and with the public regarding the fund to gather input about those priorities. What do you think of this priority list? And also, what project ideas do you have? And then we would anticipate coming back to you further on in the process as we gain more clarity about what's eligible and begin to have more of a refined list of projects.
That sounds great. So we know that all the municipalities are getting funding. We know like the airport is they're getting a lot of money. And the schools the city district and the county district will also each get direct funding. Do we know how much the schools are likely to get, order of magnitude?
I don't have that answer. We can make a note of it. And again, that has to do with the overall American Rescue Plan.
Yeah.
And so our eyes at this point, for the purpose of this discussion, have been on local fiscal recovery fund, but there is education funding that we can follow up on and try to learn more about. I'm sure that they're awaiting guidance similarly to us.
Okay, great.
Can I have a quick?
I think the airport's getting more than $10 million of additional funds. They've gotten earlier funding too. So it's going to be an awesome little airport.
Quick request, as you all sort of pull everything you heard into categories, could you delineate the ones where there might be opportunities to partner with some of the other jurisdictions or entities getting relief funding?
Indeed, that's one of the criteria that seems critical. We've heard about the conversation related to equity, and we'll want to include that as maybe there are equity-focused projects, but as a factor for consideration, partnership and equity are both on the list.
Awesome, thank you.
All right. Avril, anything else?
We will see you on next Tuesday for our regular meeting. I just want to remind you, I'll be at the office on Wednesday and Thursday, and the offices are closed on Friday for Good Friday.
Okay. Great, thank you. Thank you to all the staff for, I think this was like excellent information. So I know we're still pretty early in the budget process, but this was really good. So thank you all for putting all this together. So we are adjourning almost exactly on time. So thanks everyone for showing up and throwing your ideas in the mix.